one of the leading figures of materialism, actually, Michael Tye, who, you won't know his name if you haven't done sort of a PhD in philosophy, but he's a huge figure going back to the 80s, one of the leading proponents of materialism. And he's recently converted in his most recent book to a kind of panpsychist view, which is just, it's sort of like Richard Dawkins becoming a Christian or something. It's like, oh my God, he's very much influenced by thinking about this kind of concern about how consciousness emerged in evolution. But I mean, this was popular actually soon after Darwin. Psychologists and philosophers like William James quickly saw that the Darwinian picture seemed to fit much better with a panpsychist worldview.
Everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the all-important job of finding out what panpsychism is all about and why the philosophical position is gaining huge traction in philosophy, but not only, also with physicists and other scientists. Now, the idea that consciousness is the fundamental nature of the physical world is by no means a new one. And it does seem to resolve some of the problems of how consciously experiencing life forms could have evolved out of non-conscious, non-living material. But most materialists balk at the idea and consider it absolutely bonkers, for reasons which we're going to find out in a bit as we attempt to pay respect to some of the criticisms of the position too. So fortunately, to navigate this tricky philosophical quagmire, we have one of the best known and most passionate supporters of panpsychism, author and professor of philosophy at Durham University, Philip Goff. Philip's research focuses on how to integrate consciousness into our scientific worldview, and he argues that the traditional approaches to materialism, that consciousness can be explained in terms of physical processes in the brain, and dualism, that consciousness is separate from the body and the brain, face unresolvable difficulties. Now, his first book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, which is an academic book, was published in 2017. And then his first book aimed at the general audience, Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness, was published shortly after in 2019. He also has a podcast, Mind Chat, which he rightly hosts with a philosopher of a completely opposite point of view. And he's involved in a book of essays on consciousness, which will be out this year, called Is Consciousness Everywhere? Essays on Panpsychism. And that's a collection of essays by scientists and philosophers published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. And the contributors include Carlo Rovelli, Sean Carroll, Lee Smolin, Annika Harris, Christoph Koch, and Anil Seth, several of whom are appearing in this series of Chasing Consciousness. So I think that is really a text to be looking out for, especially as it'll include opposite points of view. Very, very interesting to see how those measure up together. And now, listeners, all the books, quotes, scientific papers, concepts, and conversation points are exhaustively included in the show notes should anyone want to check the authority of all the research and ideas that we're citing. On the website, there are even more should I be unable to fit them all in, so please use them. I am such a stickler for well-referenced claims. And a quick thank you to you all for your support on the project so far. Keep spreading the word by sharing the shows with your friends. And if you can, give me a 5-star rating on iTunes. I'd be hugely grateful. Really helps get it out to like minds. And for those who want to support my work directly, you can make a contribution of any size at all, even a cup of coffee, via PayPal on the website. Keeps me pumping this content out. And please follow the show on Instagram and Facebook to be kept informed of all of the new shows as they come out. Keep feeding back to me via the website or via social media with any guest suggestions and all of your ideas on these things that we're discussing. Now, I have been holding out to speak to Philip Goff about panpsychism since long before the launch of the podcast. So I'm literally itching to get started. So without further ado, let's go. So Philip Goff, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you?
I'm very well, Freddie. Thanks for having me on. Good to be here.
It's a great, great honor and something me and my listeners have been waiting for some time. So thank you so much for making yourself available. Now, Philip, before we get into the technicalities, I'd love to start by getting the humanity over to the listeners of our guests and finding out what were the big burning questions that burned in your mind when you first became conscious as an adolescent. I mean, it reminds us that you're a real person like the rest of us and not just a rigorous academic. What can you remember from that time that sticks out as significant?
Well, as an adolescent, well, I remember, I think probably my first philosophical question was, I remember I was raised Catholic, and I remember asking the priest, what happened to Adam and Eve when the Big Bang happened? So trying to reconcile these two different stories I was hearing in my head. And I think that sort of sums up a lot of what's always driven me. How does everything fit together? These different stories of reality that we take to be true, of the mind and the body and so on. How do they all fit together? But yeah, I mean, I guess I've always been obsessed by the problem of consciousness that I guess we'll be talking about a lot. Whether morality was objective, I used to wonder about. I remember, I decided it wasn't. And I kissed my best friend's girlfriend when I was about 15. I said, look, it's okay. There's no morality. And he didn't didn't really buy that. But and later in my graduate study, changed my mind on that. And I'm now sort of pretty hardcore believer in objective morality. But yeah, just all these big philosophical questions. Does God exist? Do we have free will? How does the mind connect to the brain? Those questions, I guess, where it's not obvious how you find out the answer. If you can imagine, the experiment we could do that'd settle it, I'm not so interested. I mean, they're very interesting questions as well. But what's always got me is the things that not only is it a question we don't know the answer to, but it's not even obvious how we find out the answer, which I think was Isaiah Berlin's definition of philosophy, actually. Yeah. Questions where it's not obvious how to look for the answer.
And it's one of the most frustrating things in the world is to know that the answer you're looking for is actually completely inaccessible. It slightly sort of makes you wonder, like, why am I actually doing this?
Yeah. So I guess, some people might think if we can't answer it with an experiment, then we just can't answer it. And, that is one philosophical position in its own right. My worry with that answer is that it kind of seems to be self-defeating, because it's already answering at least one philosophical question, which is, can we answer philosophical questions? And it's saying no. But in saying no, it's already answered a philosophical question. So it's sort of kind of self-defeating. So philosophy is annoying. It keeps you awake at night, but I think there's no escape from it, really, sadly.
Certainly not when adolescents find themselves thinking about it, in the middle of the night, when they're 12 or 13, surely that means it's quite central to the world.
Yeah. Oh, just actually, I guess the obvious question actually that I wrestled with as an adolescent is one many people have who start thinking philosophically at age 13 or so. I wonder whether what I see as green is what you see as red. And how would we ever know? I can't look inside your head. Maybe we're all seeing different colors and we don't know. And yeah, I remember my older cousin used to come and stay and hang out with my big brother, and they often didn't want to play with me, but sometimes we'd have these philosophical discussions about, could colors be different for all of us? And those intuitions, I think towards the early part of the 20th century, or sort of the mid 20th century, philosophers sort of thought that those intuitions are a bit silly. You grow out of them. People like Wittgenstein thought they're confused, childish intuitions. Then we see they're all rooted in confusion. But I'm inclined to think that was a sort of snobbish attitude in a way. And actually, those intuitions that kind of 13, 14-year-olds have, I wonder if I'm in the matrix, this kind of stuff, I think are, pretty solid starting points for doing philosophy.
I agree. Now, on to our main topic for today. Now, you've mapped very, very well this massive rise in the number of philosophers and even physicists and other scientists who are supporting some form of panpsychism. And the reasons for this are beautifully presented in your book for the general public, Galileo's Error, which I mentioned in the intro, and you can find links to in the show notes, listeners. But panpsychism is by no means a new concept. Can you start by explaining for the listeners who may be unfamiliar with the term what it means and what the panpsychist philosophical position holds, and a bit of the history?
Yeah, so panpsychism, I guess, is goes back as long as there's been philosophy, really, in both East and West, and it's roughly the idea that consciousness or mind is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical universe. So mind is everywhere. Doesn't necessarily mean literally everything has a mind, but at the fundamental level of reality, perhaps the basic particles making up our universe have some kind of simple, rudimentary form of consciousness. So this was, I guess it has had a big influence throughout the history of philosophy. In the early period after the scientific revolution, many of the leading thinkers like Leibniz or Spinoza, Leibniz, who came up with calculus, was hated by Newton because they both came up with calculus at the same time. Great mathematician. And had something of a heyday even as late as the 19th century. And actually, one of my colleagues, Peter West, who's a historian of philosophy, tweeted this great quote a couple of weeks ago from Susan Stebbing in, I think it was 1937, saying in passing, of course, all physicists nowadays are idealists, which is a view quite close to panpsychism, that mind is fundamental. And she said, I'm yet to meet a physicist who is not an idealist. So these views actually were incredibly common right up until, I think something seems to have happened after the Second World War. I don't know. We had quite an about turn. And in those post-war years, we have sort of a anti-philosophy zeitgeist in many ways. I don't know. Historians could tell us maybe it's something to do with the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust and so on. But anyway, we turned at that point to more of a materialist philosophy, that really there's just the kind of stuff physical science tells us, and everything can be reductively explained in terms of the electrochemical processes we get from physical science. And that is still, I would say, probably the most popular of the options among Anglophone philosophers. Actually, there's this recent Phil Papers survey of philosophers' opinions that was done a couple of years ago, asking professional philosophers, do you believe in God? Do you think we have free will, and so on? And the results were that 52% are materialists about consciousness. So, just over half, as opposed to 32% who oppose materialism, who think we can't fully explain mind or consciousness in the terms of physical science. So, and then 15% are agnostic or don't like the question or something. So still, it's the more popular view. But as you can see, 52 to 32. It's not quite Brexit, but it's there's a very, very, very significant minority now. When I was studying philosophy, it was hardly anybody opposed materialism. It's now 32% of philosophers, and so there's been quite a change, and I think the trajectory seems to be growing. We had the first plenary session on panpsychism at the big annual philosophy conference a couple of years ago, and one of the leading figures of materialism, actually, Michael Tye, who, you won't know his name if you haven't done sort of a PhD in philosophy, but he's a huge figure going back to the 80s, one of the leading proponents of materialism. And he's recently converted in his most recent book to a kind of panpsychist view, which is just, it's sort of like Richard Dawkins becoming a Christian or something. It's like, oh my God.
Massive, isn't it? And Bertrand Russell was involved in the sort of renaissance of panpsychism. Tell us a little bit about his things.
Yeah, I suppose you kind of think of Russell as a materialist or something, but that's maybe a bit anachronistic, because Russell goes back to the early 20th century. So I think it wasn't so unusual for a mainstream philosopher to be engaged with this kind of thinking in the 1920s when Russell did. So yeah, I mean, and it's very much the rediscovery of these ideas of Russell from the 1920s that has been the cause of this renaissance of philosophy. Renaissance of panpsychism in recent Anglophone philosophy. So yeah, there was all this rich thought on it in the 1920s, and then something happened. I don't know. I sort of speculate that sort of the Great Depression and the two wars, and we had a completely different zeitgeist after that. But anyway, yeah, Russell's starting point was really starting with the science. Russell in the 1920s was reflecting on relativity and quantum mechanics, these radically new scientific theories. He was one of the few people who could, really understand both the mathematics and the science and the philosophy. He was trying to put it all together. But one thing that struck him about physical science is that it doesn't really tell us what matter is, which seems a kind of strange thing to say. That you think, well, doesn't physics tell us what matter? Isn't that the whole point of physics? But what Russell appreciated actually is that the whole business of physics is not telling us what matter is, but just what it does. Right? Physics tells us how electrons behave, how they interact. It's not really telling us what an electron is. And he made that claim quite precise and persuasive. And then his thought was, well, if that's right, there's sort of a gap in our scientific theory of the world. Our physics, for all its virtues, isn't really telling us what matter is. And he kind of put that together with the problem of consciousness. We've got this hole in science. We're trying to find a place for consciousness, for mind or consciousness. Maybe we can put consciousness in the hole. And that's what led him to this kind of panpsychist theory of reality, which has become a much discussed and much published art and view in the last sort of 8 to 10 years.
We should probably take a moment out to say how most of cognitive science thinks what consciousness actually is. I mean, what is consciousness, and why has something we all experience so quotidianly been so hard for science to arrive at a consensus on?
Yeah, consciousness, it's a little bit of an ambiguous word, isn't it? I think the way it's most standardly used and the way I use it is just to mean subjective experience. Your consciousness is just what it's like to be you. So, right now you're seeing colors, hearing sounds, feeling the touch of the clothes on your body if you pay attention. This is all part of what it's like to be you right now. And that's all we really mean by consciousness. So this is certainly something that's pretty pervasive in the animal kingdom. Sheep, rabbits, they're not sophisticated conceptual thinkers in the way human beings are, but they certainly have subjective experience of the world around them. So in a way, it's the most obvious thing there is. People sometimes say it's a great mystery what consciousness is. I don't agree that that's the right way to put it. Nothing's more obvious than your own feelings and experiences. You know what pain is when you feel it. The mystery is not what consciousness is, but where it comes from, how it comes to be, how it fits in with our overall scientific theory of reality. We've made great progress in our scientific understanding of the brain, the chemistry of the brain, and the large-scale functions, but none of that has seemed to shed any light on how brains manage to produce this inner world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes that we know every second of waking life. So that's really the deep mystery here, where it comes from. And some people think it's, we just need to plug away with the science and we'll crack it eventually. But I think this is consciousness isn't just another scientific problem. There are philosophical underpinnings to the difficulty that make it radically different, I think, from many of the other tasks science faces.
And this is the problem with consensus, isn't it? That the sort of more materialist point of view says, listen, we're looking for the correlates in the brain. But the problem is that a correlate, a brain activity, something you see on an EEG or something lighting up, it doesn't actually describe the experience. So there's a gap there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way into it. Everybody agrees that certain kinds of brain activity are correlated with certain kinds of experience. That's clear from daily experience, but also the more we've studied the brain, we can sort of pin down that a little bit more. But and sometimes you get people presenting that as though it settles the matter. Well, look, you stimulate bits of the brain, you get consciousness. Actually, my conversation with Joe Rogan, this is what we got stuck on. He was sort of saying, look, you put chemicals in your brain, you have experience. Right. So, yeah. So, of course, certain kinds of brain activity goes along with certain kinds of experience. But what we ultimately want explained is why? Why does certain kind of brain activity go along with certain kinds of experience? Why should that be? Nothing we know about the electrochemical nature of those processes gives us any reason to think that they should go along with, I don't know, a feeling of pain or hunger or any kind of feeling at all. Why aren't we just complicated mechanisms?
That's definitely something we're going to be coming back to, isn't it? But listen, let's get back to the sort of basics of the concept itself for those who may be unfamiliar about it by getting into some of the reasons we might think this was true. Now, a few of the really strong arguments are very attractive to those of us who are trying to sort of not necessarily solve the problem of consciousness, but come to some sort of closure where we can say, okay, yeah, I'm cool with that. And the respected analytical philosopher Galen Strawson gives one that rings really, really true to me, and it was the one that actually brought me to panpsychism in the first place. That it seems more logical to think that there has been some building block of consciousness present in matter since the beginning of evolution, rather than to hypothesize this seemingly magical something from nothing jump from non-conscious matter to conscious matter. Can you explain this argument for us a little?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways of running a kind of evolutionary story, evolutionary argument. Actually, I mentioned Michael Tye, this philosopher who had this radical conversion from materialism to panpsychism, and he's very much influenced by thinking about this kind of concern about how consciousness emerged in evolution. But I mean, this was popular actually soon after Darwin. Psychologists and philosophers like William James quickly saw that the Darwinian picture seemed to fit much better with a panpsychist worldview. I mean, the way I've argued about it in some work is thinking about the dramatic change of something going from being non-conscious to conscious. So, you might think, well, what did it appear in when you have a few cells together, when you have a more complex life form, where you have this slight different neuronal pattern? What is it that makes the difference? And it seems like such a radical change of the lights going on, of sentience appearing, seems to mark a significant transition, a leap in nature. I mean, you could say, well, why isn't it like that with anything, going from non-life to life? I think the difference is with consciousness, and maybe don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but I think there's good arguments that we can't make sense of consciousness as a vague phenomenon, vague in this technical philosophical sense of having fuzzy borderline regions in between non-consciousness and consciousness. So think about a cloud, right? A cloud is vague around the edges. There's no exact point where the cloud suddenly stops and then you've got sky. There's a little bit of water vapor, a little bit less. Or imagine someone balding, as I'm sadly doing these days. There's no exact point where there's no exact loss of one hair that makes the difference between someone who's bald or not bald. It's a slow process, and there's no kind of precise boundary between being bald or not being bald, being young or being old, being non-living, being living, all of these things, there's fuzzy boundaries. But when it comes to consciousness, many philosophers have noted it's very hard to make sense of the idea of something that's neither definitely conscious nor definitely not conscious. You can make sense of something having a little bit of consciousness, a little bit of experience, but something either has experience or it doesn't, right? It doesn't seem to make sense of there being a kind of fuzzy borderline case. In which case, if that's right, then what must have made the difference between consciousness and non-consciousness and consciousness, either in evolution or if we're thinking of, a fetus, an embryo becoming a fetus, it must have been some utterly precise change, some kind of slight movement of particles. And that just seems really implausible that some tiny slight change like that could have made such a dramatic difference of switching on the lights, consciousness appearing. The philosopher Eric Schwitzgebel is someone you should get on, actually. He's a materialist, but a really interesting philosopher who's defended what he calls crazyism, which is whatever viewers write about consciousness, it's got to be crazy because none of the sensible options seem to make sense. But he's got a really interesting recent paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies on discussing the paradoxical nature of trying to make sense of consciousness as having fuzzy boundaries and what a challenge that is. So that's one route into panpsychism, I think.
But how would the critics come back against Galen Strawson there? How would they explain emergence of something from nothing like that?
So I guess what we need to start with really is whether the traditional materialist view makes sense, whether we can just fully account for conscious experience in the terms of physical science, in the kind of electrochemical signaling of the brain. And many people think, okay, we can't do it now, but how can we rule out that we'll one day do it? And I suppose that the way I tend to start the argument is that physical science works with a purely quantitative language, whereas our conscious experience is permeated with these subjective qualities, these colors, sounds, smells, tastes. And you can't even articulate those qualities in this purely quantitative language of physical science. You can't capture in an equation that, the deep red you experience as you watch the setting sun. And so inevitably, if your description of the brain is framed in a purely quantitative vocabulary of neuroscience, you really just leave out these qualities and hence really just leave out consciousness itself. And as part of the point of my book Galileo's Error is to argue this isn't a surprise, really. Galileo, back in the 17th century, designed physical science to be purely mathematical, purely quantitative, and he effectively said, you can't capture the qualities of experience, the colors, the sounds, the smells, the taste in this kind of language. So we'll have to put them outside of science so that everything else can be captured mathematically. That was a really good move. And now people are thinking, well, it's going to apply to consciousness as well. Well, no, it's gone really well because it was designed to ignore consciousness. The very quantitative nature of the domain was set up in such a way that it excluded consciousness. So I think, we need to find a way to bring back together what Galileo separated. Galileo separates quantitative science from qualitative consciousness. We need to find a way to bring them back together in a single unified theory of reality. And panpsychism offers us a very good way of doing that.
But surely subjective experience has causal power. I know that this is actually a little bit controversial these days, but it shows us that it's not just an illusionary byproduct of brain chemistry, but it is a thing in itself. There are reactions in the body, reactions outside of ourselves that are directly caused by our experiences. Tell us about this downward causation idea and how it flies a little bit in the face of this reductive neurobiological explanation.
So I think maybe so certainly consciousness does do stuff, right? If my itchiness causes me to scratch, my pain causes me to shout out, my conscious thoughts are in some way influencing the movements of my lips right now, my movements of my fingers, and some of these things, obviously, that there's an instinctive component. Your hand shoots off the stove faster than you feel the pain, and so on. But nonetheless, I think there are clear cases in which your consciousness has an impact. For example, if the doctor says 1 to 10, how much does it hurt? Clearly, you're attending to your conscious experience when you answer that question, and so the character of your conscious experience is influencing your answer. Or if you're writing a book on consciousness, it'd be a bit weird if your own conscious experience had no role to play in influencing your thoughts and influencing what you write in that book. Now, so this needn't be a problem for a materialist, because they will say, well, sure, consciousness does something, brain processes do something, because they're the same thing. They might say, it's just like, saying water, the water causes something, the H2O causes something, but they're just the same thing. There's no kind of overdetermination there. Water just is H2O. And for the materialist, feelings and experiences just are patterns of neural firings. So then I guess, we might come back to the argument against materialism, although many panpsychists also will tell a very reductionist story. So panpsychist, like a really good panpsychist philosopher, Luke Roloff's got an excellent book, Combining Minds, with Oxford University Press, although it's not really aimed at a general audience. It's a very good book if you've done a bit of philosophy, got a bit of philosophy background. But he has, even though he's not a materialist, he's a panpsychist. He thinks particles are conscious. But apart from that, he has a very reductionist picture. So really, on his view, my mind is just a complex collection of conscious particles, right? There's really nothing more to my mind than a complex combination of conscious particles. That is still too reductionist to me. There seems to be something deeply unified and cohesive about my mind that resists that kind of reductionist story. And where I find it falls down most of all is when we're thinking about, and this is something I'm going to talk a lot more about in my new book, conscious thought and understanding. Often when we talk about consciousness, we talk about kind of sensations like colors, sounds, smells, what I've been talking about already. But also we shouldn't forget that our experience is permeated with meaning and understanding. What things are and what they mean is part of the character of our experience. If you think about understanding the rules of chess or thinking about mathematics, this is itself a kind of rich conceptual experience. And I find it very hard to tell any kind of reductionist story about that. If you think about like the moment of me consciously grasping a mathematical proof, that experience of the aha moment of consciously understanding a mathematical proof, are we to suppose that that's made up of lots of little partial understandings or something? I think that it really falls apart at that level when we're thinking about the experience of understanding or thinking. I think there's something irreducibly unified about entertaining a thought.
On that note, I just feel that it might be a good idea here just to come back to the sort of definition of panpsychism before we continue with some more arguments that might support this. Now, in what way does a panpsychist hold that consciousness is fundamental to the world? Speak a little bit about how we would say that the physical world has its foundation in consciousness. How do you describe that, just in a couple of phrases?
So as I say, the view isn't necessarily that everything is conscious. A standard way of thinking about it is that the fundamental particles making up our universe, perhaps electrons and quarks, have incredibly simple forms of experience. So we're not saying they have the kind of experience that a human being has, which is, as we've said, permeated with meaning and understanding. But subjective experience comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Think about the experience of a fly or a bed bug. As we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of experience. For the panpsychist, this continues right down to the basic building blocks of matter, which have incredibly simple forms of experience to reflect the very simple nature. And touching on what we said earlier, it's not that the panpsychist is necessarily adding anything. It's not that they're saying, oh, there's the story physics tells us about, and then there's this weird consciousness stuff as well. The more typical way of doing it is to say, at the fundamental level, there's just consciousness, perhaps just complex networks of conscious experience. And actually, the story physics tells us emerges from that more fundamental consciousness-based story. And this was really Russell's insight. Russell thought physics is purely mathematical. What do physicists tell us about? They really just tell us there's a bunch of mathematical structures at the fundamental level of reality. They don't really tell us anything more. As Hawking said, that physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations. So the panpsychist says, okay, if there's complicated networks of conscious entities at the fundamental level, and through their interactions, they realize certain mathematical structures, then you can get physics out of that. So here's a simple way of putting the case of panpsychism. It's very hard to see how you can get consciousness from physics. It's actually dead easy to see how you get physics from consciousness. Well, so why not do it that way around?
It's definitely the attraction, isn't it? And some critics even think that panpsychism is a dualist position, don't they? Is it a dualist position? I don't think it is.
No. So this is for example, the physicist, very interesting physicist, Sabine Hossenfelder, critiqued panpsychism in this way, thinking the idea is the particles have their physical properties like mass, spin, and charge, and also these funny consciousness properties. And then her thought was, why don't the funny consciousness properties show up in our experiments? But that's not the view. The view is just at the fundamental level, all there is consciousness. And so where does physics come from then? Well, physics is just about what stuff does, right? It's just mathematical models that tell us what stuff does. But it doesn't tell us what is the stuff. What is the stuff that's doing stuff? And the panpsychist answer is it's consciousness. There's complex networks of conscious entities behaving in these mathematically trackable ways. And that's what physics tells us about their behavior. Physics. So one thing I like to say sometimes is, matter is what consciousness does on the panpsychist view. There's just consciousness, but it behaves in very interesting ways. And the job of a physicist is to track its behavior in mathematical language.
The relations, as Carlo Rovelli would put it, but it doesn't tell us anything about ontology, does it? So yeah, exactly. I feel that dualism is kind of part of this. Modern science's desire to have this single monistic physical concept that unites matter and consciousness, rather than a sort of problematic Cartesian dualism that sort of separates body and mind and they have to be combined. I feel like it's playing quite a big role in why panpsychism is gaining in popularity, because people want to avoid dualism. Why is dualism less and less popular as a theory of consciousness? Is it because of this combination problem?
I mean, yeah, I suppose. I mean, I've got more time for dualism than most people, I think. It seems to me a coherent possibility. And I used to argue, like many philosophers do, that it's sort of empirically dubious. Like, we know scientifically that everything that happens in the brain can be explained without postulating some non-physical forces impacting on it. And so, going back to your question about the causation of the mind, if everything that happens in the brain can be explained without recourse to the soul or something non-physical, then it looks like there's nothing left for the non-physical to do. And that would look pretty problematic for the reasons we've been talking about if my consciousness can't actually do anything. But actually, the more I've talked to neuroscientists, I just don't think we know anywhere near enough about the brain, the actual workings of the brain, to be able to make that case, really, that there's no kind of non-physical influence. We just don't know. Scientifically, we just don't know one way or the other. This is something I've been debating with the physicist Sean Carroll on my podcast Mind Chat. Quick plug for that. Numerous ways. I mean, he wants to say, well, look, physics is, we've got our best physics theory, and we should think that's well confirmed, and we should think that's going to give us a complete story of what's happening with the particles in our brains. And so, if there were something non-physical having an influence here, that would falsify the theory to some extent. But as Carroll concedes, the experiments on which we base physics standardly involve very small numbers of particles. So I can't see how experiments on small numbers of particles can give us decisive confidence that in very, very complicated biological systems, those rules are not modified to some extent, or certain different principles give way. We don't have to think there's something really spooky or supernatural going on. Many dualists, like the philosopher David Chalmers, don't necessarily believe in something supernatural like a soul. They just think there's some new principles kicking in at certain higher levels of complexity. And I don't think there's anything in science we know that can decisively rule that out. In fact, many neuroscientists, such as Kevin Mitchell, are kind of open to that possibility and indeed exploring it. So, okay, so far I've said, why dualism ain't so bad. I guess the worry I would have about it is just one of parsimony. As philosophers and scientists, we try to respect Occam's razor, have the most simple, parsimonious theory we can. Why believe in two kinds of thing when you can just believe in one kind of thing? So I think you put it quite well. It's panpsychism offers the simplicity of materialism, without the kind of incoherent struggle materialism has had to account for consciousness at all.
So just before we try and steelman a little bit of the counter arguments so you can respond to them, is there anything else that's a sort of nail in the coffin argument from your point of view? Is there anything that comes up in Galileo's error that you think is just so important that it needs to be said at this point?
I mean, here's one way I like to put it. You've got three options, really. So our question is, why is brain activity correlated with conscious experience? And you've got three options. Either we explain consciousness in terms of the physical, in terms of matter, that's the materialist option. Or you do it the other way around. You explain matter and physics in terms of consciousness. That's the panpsychist option. Or you take both as basic and fundamental. That's the dualist option. I'd say the materialist option is just incoherent when you reflect carefully, which is sort of what you trained as a philosopher. It just really doesn't make sense to try, and we can't make coherent sense of the idea that subjective qualitative experience can be exhaustively accounted for in terms of purely objective quantitative brain processes. So that doesn't make sense. Dualism kind of makes sense, but it's just unnecessarily complicated. So that leaves panpsychism. It's simple, it's coherent, does the job.
So tell us, let's try and represent really fairly your opponents, such as Dan Dennett or any of the other people you've had the huge privilege of debating this with, presumably quite heated conversations. Let's try and steelman how they would come back at you and just explain them one by one, the kind of criticisms the materialists level at you, and just respond to them quickly one by one so we can just feel like we've done justice to those great minds.
There's so many different responses here. I mean, Daniel Dennett is probably the most uncompromising in this. I think he wouldn't mind me using that label to him. I mean, he just thinks the job of science is to deal with public observation and experiment. You know, that's our business, right? Everything else is BS, right? Whereas I agree with Dennett that if you religiously follow that through, you won't believe in consciousness, because consciousness is not known about through observation experiments. You know, it's not something we discover looking down a microscope. You know about it in a very different way through your immediate awareness of your feelings and experiences. So I don't know whether that's an argument from Dennett, but it's a sort of science. The job of science isn't to deal with these mysterious, invisible feelings and experiences that we can't look at through a microscope.
So he just says that's not relevant to science. We can't have a science of consciousness in that sense.
Yeah, we can't have a science of consciousness in the way we understand science. And so in a way, there's a great commonality between me and Dennett, because I agree that our traditional scientific approach, our scientific approach at the moment, can't adequately deal with this, because it's all about accounting for public observation experiment. But so you can go two ways with that. You can either say, okay, so it doesn't exist, like Dennett and my co-host of my podcast, Keith Frankish, thinks we argue about all the time. Or you can say, well, look, it exists. I've just felt pain. And so we need to expand our conception of what science is. It doesn't mean we can't have a science of it, but we need to rethink what science is. So that's the more radical approach, sometimes called illusionism. Just consciousness is just an illusion to start off with. At least consciousness we can dispute exactly what we mean by consciousness. Everyone believes in consciousness in some sense.
Well, Dennett and lovely Sue Blackmore. Sue's coming on the show in this series, and she's going to be refuting free will. And Dan Dennett even tries to keep free will in his illusionism, but Sue is absolutely brutal with her Zen approach. So anybody's interested in the complete opposite of this, do check out the free will episode with Sue Blackmore. But yes, that is probably the more extreme end of the various possibilities. What else? Who else has got something? I mean, Anil Seth, who I know is a close colleague of yours. How would he push back on this?
So Anil and I have had quite a lot of debates, and we've got another one coming up in November. And yeah, I suppose Anil's approach is to say, yeah, there seems to be a problem here, but let's just keep doing the science and it'll go away. He, like others, makes an analogy to the problem of life. You know, there used to be this deep mystery about people used to think there's this deep mystery about how we can explain life. Maybe we have to postulate life as a fundamental force. This was the position of vitalism. But Anil thinks we just, plugged away at the experimental science, and then people just sort of forgot about the problem. So he thinks it's gonna go the same way with consciousness. So is that enough steel managed? Shall I give you the response?
Well, I mean, that's more of a sort of correlations of consciousness argument, which is this is all physical. This is purely a sort of emergent byproduct. Does anybody have anything stronger that really takes apart the experience itself in some way?
I mean, probably the most popular view among philosophers, academic philosophers, which kind of gets a bit tricky to explain, but I suppose in essence, they just say, why can't we just have a basic, you're probably not going to like this either, but a basic empirical identity, right? Like water and H2O. Water and H2O, these are very different concepts. People had the concept of water for thousands of years, but didn't know what it was. They thought maybe it was a fundamental element together with earth, fire, and but now we know water just is H2O. They're just the same thing. So we don't think about how does H2O give rise to water. We just think water just is H2O. So why can't we do the same thing with feelings and experiences? And typically these people want to say, look, we really believe in consciousness. We're not like Daniel Dennett. Of course, qualia exist, feelings and experiences. We really believe in that good stuff. It's what life's all about. But it turns out science has shown they're just patterns of neural firings. And, that's probably they would generally say there isn't a hard problem. It's just an empirical identity. I guess that's how satisfying do you find that?
And you would agree with that, in as much as the fact that panpsychism is a monism. It's just that all of that has a basis in consciousness. That's the only difference that you have on that, right?
Yeah, so I suppose it depends which way you'd run the identity. So I suppose they think when you learn the physical nature, then patterns of neural firings, that's the real nature of the state. Whereas I run it the other way around. I think when the brain scientist thinks about the state as patterns of neural firings, that's not wrong, but it's just really telling you what the state does and what its parts do. When you learn what kind of feeling, what kind of experience it is, that's when you're learning the real nature of the state and the real nature of your brain. So, on this kind of view, think about it. If you're having an experience of smelling fish or something, on my view, that fishy smell is the real nature of your brain, the real physical nature of your brain, which feels a bit weird. So,
well, I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask was about primacy. It's like maybe the problem here is trying to say that consciousness is primary to matter, or that matter is primary to consciousness, and actually the fact that we can only establish that they're correlated and not which one is causing the other. Why not just abandon that altogether and say these things are co-arising? They're both as equally valid as each other, and neither one is causing each other, which is pretty much a Buddhist position. Why this need to say that consciousness is primary?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So just to clarify, you're not thinking as a kind of dualism, that they're both different?
Well, I don't know how a Buddhist
together
would answer this, because I'm not a Buddhist, but the old Buddhist philosophy position is that the physical world co-arises with consciousness, that they are hand in hand. I don't know how that would be sort of established, whether we would call that a dualism. I know that one of the big problems of dualism is this combination problem. It's like, how and in what way are they the same thing, and how are they connecting? But my question is more direct to you. Why do you feel it's necessary? I mean, I do have a personal reason why I think it is necessary, but why do you think that consciousness is primary to any physical matter?
I suppose it's something like a process of elimination. It's sort of we've got to start somewhere. As Wittgenstein said, I don't like a lot of Wittgenstein, but I like this line. He said, explanations have to end somewhere. We have to start with something. And we just look through the options. We start with matter. That seems a problem because we can't get consciousness out. We start with consciousness. Actually, I think we can get physics and matter out of that. So that's a good starting point. We could start with both. And I don't know whether the Buddhist view you're talking about, that they always come together. That could still be a dualist view in that. So it's not dualism in the Descartes sense that most of reality is just a physical mechanism and then God adds the ghost in the machine. That it seems like the dualist view you're talking about seems to be the Buddhist view you're talking about is maybe more of a unified picture of the world where from the start matter and consciousness go hand in hand. But still, that seems like a dualist view. And again, for parsimony reasons, it'd be better to just have one thing.
Now, Philip, I wanna bring in time here. There's a problem that has always troubled me, actually, ever since I started studying physics, and I'm still struggling to reconcile the implications, even having talked to top physicists about it. So, in this second series, I've spoken with physicist Paul Davies and Carlo Rovelli about the implications of the block universe theory, Einstein's theory, following on from the theory of relativity. Now, the theory holds that past, present, and future, and the arrow of time that we perceive all coexist in one single block. Now, I can't help but think that this further supports a panpsychist position with all possible evolution over time, from the least possible consciousness to the greatest advancement of consciousness, somehow present in a single block of time and space. But I'm not sure how to argue for it, so I thought I might ask a professional philosopher to help me out here. What are the implications of the block universe theory for the way we talk about panpsychism?
It's a really interesting argument. I'll have to think about it a bit more myself. And there have been really interesting stuff written about panpsychism and time. And Barry Dainton, actually, my former colleague at the University of Liverpool, has written a really interesting recent paper that I think you can get on his website, thinking about from a panpsychist perspective what it must be like to be a photon, because photons have literally a timeless, changeless existence because they travel at the speed of light. So going back to, Einstein spent a lot of time wondering what it would be like to ride on a beam of light in developing relativity. And so Dainton is sort of thinking of the panpsychist analog. What would it be like to actually be a beam of light or a photon from a panpsychist perspective, and worries that this is, can we even make sense of sort of changeless experience? And Susan Schneider in Scientific American had an article challenging panpsychism in this way from a slightly different perspective, bringing up that in many contemporary theoretical physics, we don't get time at the fundamental level. Time is a kind of emergent phenomenon. And so if you're a panpsychist and you think consciousness is at the fundamental level, but the fundamental level is timeless, Schneider thinks, can we really make sense of a conscious experience that takes up no time at all? But actually, I'm not that fond of the block universe. Actually, in my academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, I tried out an argument against the block theory of reality, which you might be interested in. So the argument was, if on the block universe theory, there's nothing that both has my conscious experience and persists through time. So there's something that persists through time, namely these space-time worms. So on a block universe view, the thing that persists through time are these sort of four-dimensional things stretched out. So if you think about me, you think about me stretched out from 1978 when I was born to when am I going to die? 2060? I don't know. Let's say you've got this thing, this space-time worm stretched out over four dimensions. Now, but that thing doesn't have my experience. Maybe it has some kind of weird all-at-once experience stretching out over 80 years or whatever, but it doesn't have my experience, which is at the present moment. The thing in the block universe view, the thing that has my experience are what are sometimes called the temporal parts of the worm, like the time slices, but they don't persist through time. They're just over in a second. So there's nothing that has normal human consciousness and persists through time. Or another way of putting it, on this view, insofar as we think about the thing that has my consciousness, it's going to stop it. It's going to cease to exist in a moment's time. And it's going to cease to exist, and it's going to cease to exist. We're effectively dying all the time on the block universe view.
Or alive all the time. I mean, it's
born
both.
Also, yeah.
I mean, to say that it lasts only a moment doesn't make any sense because it's outside of time in that sense. And I think that's kind of where I was thinking it would make quite a lot of sense to say that in that block is a foundation of consciousness. Yeah. And so I sort of, that pulled me towards a panpsychist position. But it gets worse, Philip, when we start to think about evolution in these terms, because, just from my point of view, trying to get my head around this idea, it throws evolution into a doubt, because it suggests that the ingredients for any future evolution towards ever more and more complex systems is uniformly present throughout all of time. And then when we combine that with quantum mechanics, the measurement problem that appears to keep this physical world in an undetermined probabilistic state until it's measured, then reality becomes less and less as we see it, as we consciously feel it. Could it be argued that what matter and the universe are in and of themselves, which of course that ontological question will never be able to confirm, but could it be argued that it's outside of space and time and only sort of collapses into reality via consciousness, a kind of sort of Eugene Wigner approach?
Yeah, sounds interesting. And, I mean, the idea that consciousness collapses the wave function has always been there, but maybe it's been mocked a little bit.
It was associated with the 70s kind of, Fritjof Capra, Dow physics stuff, wasn't it?
Yes, I think that's
he was a serious physicist.
Yeah. That people, for whatever reason, I guess it's the thought that, you're just trying to mix two mysteries together. But actually, someone you've had on the podcast, that David Chalmers, I don't know if you talked about this, together with his collaborator, Kelvin.
He said he tried. He didn't say the results were hugely promising. He said he tried to sort of get around it with a few philosophical mathematical tricks, but I don't think he didn't sound like they nailed it.
Yeah, he really, given a proper rigorous working. I mean, I hate ideology in science and philosophy saying, this kind of view is silly, we can't think about it. I think as long as you're dealing with it with rigor, with empirical seriousness, then everything's, kosher. It's not about what you're dealing with, it's how you deal with it. And but actually it doesn't fit so well, regardless of what we think of consciousness collapses the wave function. It doesn't necessarily fit so well with panpsychism, because on a consciousness collapse the wave function view, you need, or on any collapse view, you need there to be a distinction between pre-collapse and post-collapse. Before we open the box, when Schrodinger's cat is in the box, it's shut, it's neither alive nor dead. We open the box, and then we get collapse, and it's either definitely alive or definitely dead. But if it's consciousness that's making the difference between pre and post collapse, but if consciousness is everywhere, then it looks like you'd always have collapse. If consciousness is just ubiquitous.
Hence, perhaps why the physical world appears to be so ubiquitous, if it is that all encompassing. Another of Einstein's ideas, this idea that the universe itself has its own wave function. But what about evolution, Philip? I'm sorry, I'm just going to press you on this a little bit. If the block universe does have anything to it, and of course, that remains to be seen, but it's one of our best theories until now, doesn't that throw the whole evolution question, where we started with Galen Strawson talking about, something coming out of nothing? We've got this problem of where were the building blocks for it if it came out of it in the first place? Presumably, the block universe sort of throws all that into doubt and just says, well, any evolution that's taking place is happening within this block as a sort of an illusory evolution, as part of a block that had all the ingredients in it already. Do you agree that this does put everything that we're kind of basing our material science on into a bit of question and into a bit of doubt?
So it depends. I mean, I guess a lot of people who sign up to the block universe don't necessarily think time is illusory. They'd maybe think time turns out to be different to how we thought of it. It's maybe doesn't pass in the way we tend to think of it. The future and the past, they're just as real as the present. Nonetheless, they would still say time is real, and there's a future. There's a difference between the future and the past, and what's in the future is in the future, and what's in the past is in the past. And the future evolution of the universe, whatever it turns out to be, whether it's some higher state of reality or whether it's just all the stars going out and all the energy being used up, whatever it is still in the future. It's not that it's kind of now. of course, the future is just a different point in time. But I mean, also the thing worth saying is, I mean, I don't think these things these things are still very speculative. And another interesting physicist who I've talked a lot to, Lee Smolin, who is a physicist who is not only wants to have a place for consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality. He contributed to this collection of essays on my book Galileo's Error that's coming out as a book later in the year, actually, in its own right. Called
that's in the show notes, listeners. So please come and check that out. When's it coming out?
Towards the end of 22 this year, I guess. I'm not sure exactly when. But yeah, there's skeptical voices like Carlo Rovelli, Sean Carroll, Anil Seth, but also people who are scientists and philosophers sympathetic to this. But yeah, coming back to Smolin, so not only consciousness, but he also thinks real passage of time is fundamental, and he's got ways of understanding theoretical physics that make sense of that. Basically, he holds on to time and gives up space. So he thinks there's, at the fundamental level, there's no space, but there is real time. And I'm not a physicist, but he says that makes sense. So there are always options.
I think the thing that I find so compelling here is this idea that fundamental reality could in some sense be out of space and time, and that it sort of manifests itself to us in our consciousness and in this evolution that we're noticing in our material sciences in space and time. And I guess that's the big ontological question that we're never going to quite get to. Now, listeners, all of the detail about this rise of panpsychism that Philip is one of the protagonists in this really interesting change in philosophy and the way that we're looking at the science of consciousness is in Philip's highly accessible 2019 book, Galileo's Error. Now, in this book, in the last experimental chapter, as you call it, Philip, I want to find out what you mean by that. You get into questions about meaning, value, and even alternate states of consciousness, like mystical experience, which we've covered on the show with David Luke. Really, really interesting conversation with this professor of psychology at Greenwich University. So really, listeners, do go and check that out if you're interested in alternate states of consciousness. But Philip, presumably, we could run in two directions with the implications if we embrace panpsychism. On the one hand, it's attractive, it's monistic, we can reconcile consciousness with physicalism, taking out any need for any sort of theistic or higher consciousness understanding. But on the other way, we might see consciousness as everything, and in some sense, that harks back to this ancient sort of Asian concept of the universe being like a giant mind experiencing itself through space and time. Which way do you go in that final chapter, or do you look at both of them? I mean, is it possible that the universe is part of a single consciousness, and are we looking at a form of physicalism that can include that? I mean, are these two mutually exclusive ways of going?
Good question. I think there is a bit of a split actually in the panpsychist community between those two camps you pointed to, the people who want to say, look, we're trying to get this taken serious science, none of this spiritual fluffiness, and others who see, for independent reasons, have some kind of spiritual convictions in some sense, and see panpsychism as well as its other attractions in accounting for consciousness as somehow fitting with certain spiritual convictions.
Philip, sorry to interrupt, but why does it need to be spiritual? If consciousness is underlying everything, why does the idea that the entire universe is a single mind, why would that have to be a spiritual mind idea?
Yeah, it's a good question. Depends what you mean by spiritual. We certainly needn't think of it as, if by spiritual you mean sort of supernatural or
theistic
or spooky or outside of the physical universe, then as panpsychists you don't need to think that. And I mean, that's one of the views I explored in the final chapter of my book, is if, for example, you take mystical experiences seriously, say you have a mystical experience and it seems to you in this experience that there's some higher form of consciousness underlying all things, if you're a materialist, you probably got to think that's a delusion of some kind. It's just some funny chemical reaction going on. We tend to think the other option is you've got to think it's something. If you're going to take the experience seriously as revealing something about reality, then that's going to be something outside of the physical universe. But there's a middle way option for the panpsychist. You could think, you already think the fundamental physical world is infused with consciousness. You could think this higher form of consciousness that you're apprehending in the mystical experience is just part of the intrinsic nature of the physical world, part of those forms of consciousness that underlies physics. So, it's a further step from panpsychism. And as I say, there is this split, maybe a bit like the split in the psychoanalytic community back in the day between Freud and Jung. We're quite split on this. But I suppose I'm a bit more on the spiritual side of things. I was persuaded by. I'm writing something on this at the moment, actually, for Psych magazine, is it called? I'm always impressed by William James's argument, where he says, if we're supposed to think that it's, a mystical experience could be just a delusion, but so could any experience. I could be in the Matrix, I could be dream. How do I know this table I seem to experience is really there? How do we know any experience corresponds to reality? I think all knowledge is just ultimately rooted in a decision to trust the experiences you're having correspond to reality. And it seems to me a sort of double standard to say, it's okay to trust that your sensory experiences correspond to reality, but not your mystical experiences. That I don't know what argument could justify that. And the other thing I suppose the book I'm currently working on is exploring a sort of this middle ground between God and atheism. That's the kind of billing that, people think they have to fit into one of these camps. But
this is kind of what I'm saying is I think that this idea of sort of universal mind, you've got wonderful people like Sheldrake, talking about how the sun might be a being, I just don't see why, if we go down that monistic panpsychist route, why we couldn't understand that on some level that maybe when we put all that consciousness together, we get some sort of single consciousness. Why we have to see that as some sort of woo-woo idea, even if, interesting, this came up in the David Luke Altered State of Consciousness thing. He was talking about how in all of the research, they've noticed that the default mode network, which is associated with our sense of ego and self, comes down in activity radically when we're having these psychedelic, mystical, altered states of reality. So those things that we're perceiving may not be hallucinations. That may be just when this sort of filter that's blocking so many of these extra dimensional experiences somehow is less switched on. We start to get other information coming in. For me, it doesn't have to be spiritual. We're just saying, well, listen, this is more than we've had access up to in our quotidian state of consciousness. Do you agree that there is a middle road here? It sounds like that's what you're writing about.
Absolutely. As I say, I just hate sort of ideology, and another thing I'm very impressed by is the discovery that the laws of physics are fine-tuned for life. It's for life to be physically possible. Certain numbers in physics had to fall in an incredibly narrow range, and the odds of them doing so are just more than astronomical. So it seems.
But Sean Carroll, I'm sure, came back and said, well, yes, in this universe. But in any other universe, there could be an infinite number of universes where it wasn't fine-tuned for life. So it's a frustrating counter-argument, isn't it?
So, look, even if, so the two standard options on this are God of some kind or the multiverse, and then all the religious people say, oh, well, it's God, isn't it? And all the non-religious people say, oh, well, it's the multiverse. But I think, look, even the multiverse is incredibly speculative physics, and so I think that anyone just with an unbiased mind looking at the evidence of fine-tuning, you at least ought to give some degree of confidence to most of these options. But actually, what I've argued for, I've been particularly focused on recently is I actually think there's a sort of fallacious reasoning going on in the inference from the fine tuning to the multiverse. This is something actually probability theorists noted a couple of decades ago, something called the inverse gambler's fallacy. But bloody academia is so specialized these days,
They're not talking to each other.
Nothing. There's huge interest in this fine tuning stuff, and nobody knows about this stuff. So I'm quite pleased that I've got an article in Scientific American about it. I'm talking about it in my new book, trying to press this argument, and it gets a bit technical, and but I'm pretty convinced actually. There's just a confused line of reasoning in trying to explain the kind of multiverse style of explanation is just a flawed form of reasoning. So
I adore the fine tune for life argument, and I know it's a big part of this book. But doesn't it lead us towards an argument for God by design? I mean, this is my big worry about myself. It's like I'm so interested in the clearly demonstrable intelligence in the system. It's just so flipping brilliant, so fine tuned, so extraordinary, so intelligent. How do we go down that route without ending up with an argument for the existence of God by design?
So I think the Enlightenment ideal is to follow the evidence where it leads. And I think we should try and just separate ourselves from our biases one way or the other and say, what is this evidence suggesting? And it helps that these days we have some mathematics that tells us how evidence works, called Bayes' theorem, which makes things, when I teach these things to my undergraduates, I make them do the equations because, they're the tools we've got to use them. And I think people get a bit disappointed because but anyway, I think I would argue that it's evidence that there is some kind of goal-directedness in some sense in the early universe. I think that's just what the evidence is saying, and that's weird, but we need to face up to it. But I wouldn't go for God in the traditional sense, because I think the familiar problem of evil or suffering, I think it's very implausible that an all-powerful loving God would create a universe like this with so much suffering would bring us into existence through the horrific process of natural selection. But I think there are a number of other options. Thomas Nagel has defended the idea of teleological laws. That is just to say, laws of nature with goals built into them, future-directed laws. So this isn't a personal mind. These are just impersonal laws of nature, but with a directedness towards life of some kind. That's one option. Or you might have a non-standard designer, like the simulation hypothesis. Maybe we're just in a computer simulation designed by some bored teenager or something. Or we could have a bad God or an indifferent God or a God of limited powers. Maybe this is just the best God can do.
It's a horribly loaded word, but again, it was so refreshing to hear you talking about this middle road where we can say, listen, let's talk about these big possibilities of fine-tuning, of extreme intelligence, of potential, the universe's mind, all of these ideas. We can talk about that without having to go near this bloody God question that just throws the whole thing into such controversy that we can't, we get away from the data that we sort of started to build an argument on in the first place.
Well, I wouldn't want to just not talk about God because we just don't like. I wouldn't go for traditional God just because I think there's good evidence against it, namely the suffering we find. So I sort of think like the atheists are in denial about fine tuning. The traditional religious people are in denial about suffering. And so we need to look for a hypothesis and account for both. But yeah, I think we've got to be so careful not to, on the one hand, the Enlightenment was all about, just following the evidence where it leads. But on the other hand, it was associated with a certain conception of how science is supposed to look. And I think now the evidence has changed because of fine tuning. And I think people can't handle that. People are in denial about that because that's not how science is supposed to look. I think it's another Copernican moment in a way. Like we look back at people in the 16th century who just couldn't handle the growing evidence that the Earth was not in the center of the universe. And they tried to postulate these ad hoc movements of the planets to get around it. And and we think, oh, they were so silly. Why didn't they just accept the evidence? But I think it's like that now with fine tuning. It's like that now with consciousness. These things don't fit into our science as it's supposed to be, and people can't handle it. So I think it's very important, just to try and just look at the evidence. And
right. And
I mean, I feel silly talking about these things, like the universe having a mind and stuff. I really do feel silly, but I'm just the evidence of fine tuning is not controversial physics, really, and
we've got to take it on face value without worrying about where it will lead us, right? That's our job, is to say, listen, this is the data. We will find out over time as this sinks in what it actually means. Well, listen, it's wonderful, wonderful, Philip, to hear that you're writing a book about this and that you're looking to try and find a middle road, because we're living in such a polarized time where argumentation seems to be more fun than data, and people just love having a good old banter against each other, and they're not looking to try and find common ground. And it sounds wonderful, this new book. And if you don't mind, Philip, I would love it if you could come back when the book's out in the next couple of years and we can talk about that, because these are really, really important issues.
Sure, that would be great. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've got a few more questions as well, so I'll slip those in next time.
It's always too much to talk about.
Well, certainly with these topics, isn't it? You could go on forever. And each thing we've spoken about today is an entire sort of 2-hour conference in itself. So, Philip, it just leaves me to thank you so much for your time. I know how hugely in demand you are on so many podcasts. Wishing you all the best with this new book of essays coming out in the Journal of Consciousness. Do check the show notes, listeners, because all of Philip's books and texts and his blog are going to be in there. And keep an eye out for all this new material and this new book, which is coming out. Do we know roughly when it's due? Has your editor started hassling you yet?
No, it's just, I'm just waiting back to hear from reviewers at the moment. So it should be any day now, actually.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, it's right up there. Oh, goodness. Well, listen, thank you so much, Philip. We'll be seeing you again soon. Thanks for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Freddie. It's been good chatting.